good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are right now. It doesn't really matter, because time moves very slowly here in our story. Tonight, or today, we will wander very gently into the world of ancient Babylon. Not in the sense of rushing through kings and wars, but in the sense of walking, step by slow step, through what an ordinary day might have been like. Babylon, as you may already know, was a city in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, which quite literally means the land between the rivers, refers to the wide plain that lies between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These two rivers, in their patient, meandering flow, watered the soil, deposited silt, and made farming possible in a land that would otherwise have been rather dry and dusty. You can picture it, flat land stretching far, with channels dug out by careful hands, and the slow shimmer of water reflecting the hot sun. Now, as we begin our day in Babylon, it is worth noting that the city itself was not small. At its height, it was enclosed by great walls made of baked brick, held together with bitumen. Bitumen, a kind of natural asphalt, is sticky and dark, and it helped keep those bricks in place. One could, if one were especially curious, spend a great deal of time simply thinking about those bricks. Each one was molded out of clay, dried in the sun, or sometimes baked in a kiln. And as we know from surviving inscriptions, many bricks were stamped with the name of the king under whose reign they were made. Imagine for a moment a worker carefully pressing a stamp into the soft clay, pressing it just enough so the letters were clear, but not so much that the clay would crack. This might seem like a small thing, but when multiplied by millions of bricks, the act of stamping becomes almost meditative, like a quiet background hum to the story of the city itself. If you are listening closely, you may already feel a kind of drowsiness settle in, as if the rhythm of stamped bricks and flowing rivers is gently nudging your mind into slower waves of thought. And that, of course, is perfectly fine. Now, the morning in Babylon began early. The sun, rising over the flat horizon, brought with it both warmth and the promise of another day's labor. For farmers living just outside the city, this meant walking to their fields, which were divided into neat plots. These plots were irrigated by canals that branched off from the Euphrates. The Babylonians were very good at digging canals, straight, curved, large or small, and they kept them maintained by clearing out mud and reeds. Reeds, in fact, were everywhere. They grew in thick clumps along the riverbanks, and people used them for all sorts of things, making mats, baskets, even writing tablets when the reed was sharpened into a stylus. Let us pause on reeds for a moment, because they deserve more attention than most people give them. When a reed is freshly cut, it is green and flexible. Left in the sun, it dries to a pale straw-like color, stiff and strong. A bundle of reeds tied together could serve as a lightweight raft, or as a wall panel for a hut, or as fuel for a fire. Imagine a Babylonian child standing by the river, pulling at the stalk of a reed, peeling it apart strand by strand until only the thin inner fibers remain. These fibers could be twisted into cord or simply discarded into the water, where they would float downstream unnoticed. Such tiny, unrecorded actions remind us that the city was not only a place of kings and temples, but also a place of countless quiet gestures that made up daily life. The city itself, when viewed from a distance, might have appeared almost like a mirage. Walls, towers, the great Ziggurat rising above, all of it shimmering in the desert light. The Ziggurat of Babylon, known as Etemenanki, was a massive stepped tower, though today only fragments remain. In its time, it was said to rise to an impressive height, layer upon layer of brick. Each step required maintenance, sweeping, and repair. Birds might perch on the ledges, and dust would gather in the corners, so temple workers had to climb and clean. Think about that. A man with a broom, standing hundreds of feet up, carefully sweeping dust off the sun-baked bricks. Not exactly the image of grandeur we often imagine, but such ordinary tasks are what kept even the greatest monuments from falling into disrepair. And as we wander mentally through Babylon at dawn, we notice how sounds slowly fill the air. The bleating of goats, the creak of a cart, the splash of water being drawn from a well. Somewhere a woman grinds grain between two stones, the steady scrape forming a kind of background rhythm. This grinding of grain was a slow process, taking hours to turn barley into flour. The sound itself, repeated endlessly, must have lulled many people into a kind of trance. Even now, if you close your eyes, you might imagine the sound, soft and steady, and it may make your thoughts feel just a little heavier, your body just a little more relaxed.
At the market, which we will not fully visit until later in the day, stalls were being set up. Sellers arranged baskets of dates, jars of oil, small piles of onions, and stacks of clay pots. A seller of fish might sprinkle water over his catch to keep it from drying out too quickly in the morning heat. And somewhere nearby, scribes prepared their clay tablets, softening the clay and sharpening their reed pens. A sharpened reed stylus, if you are curious, was cut at an angle to create a wedge-shaped tip. Pressed into clay, it left the characteristic cuneiform signs that we can still read today. Of course, pressing wedge after wedge into clay could become monotonous, but monotony has its uses. It slows the pace, it quiets the mind, it makes time stretch. Now, let us not hurry. Hurrying has no place here. A day in Babylon was long, and our telling of it will be even longer. As you listen, you may find that your own breathing begins to match the pace of the story. Slow, even, perhaps a little deeper than before. That is exactly as it should be. The air in Babylon, especially in the morning, was often filled with a dry warmth. Dust rose easily from the ground, clinging to sandals and settling on clothing. People wore simple garments, wool or linen, often belted at the waist. Sandals were made of leather, though many went barefoot, especially children. And the streets, though wide in some places, were often uneven, with ruts worn by carts and puddles left behind from the last watering of the roads. Yes, roads were sometimes watered, sprinkled with water from jars to keep down the dust. Imagine the slow process of carrying jar after jar, pouring out water, watching it darken the dusty ground for just a little while before drying again under the sun. The gates of the city, tall and heavy with bronze fittings, opened to let in traders from the countryside. Donkeys carried baskets of goods, their hooves clopping steadily. A donkey's pace is neither fast nor slow, but steady, dependable, and that, in many ways, describes Babylon itself. Steady, enduring, carried along not by sudden bursts of speed, but by the endless repetition of daily tasks. As we reach the middle of the morning in our wandering imagination, we might pause and consider time itself. How did the Babylonians mark time? They had sundials, of course, and they watched the shadows. But more often, time was measured not by hours and minutes, but by cycles of work. And they give the day a different kind of rhythm, a slower rhythm, a gentler rhythm, the kind of rhythm that might, even now, help you feel that sense of drifting, as if the edges of your awareness are softening like shadows at the edge of the desert. And so the morning continues, little by little. Nothing dramatic happens, nothing needs to happen. The city simply breathes, alive with its ordinary motions, dust rising, sandals shuffling, goats bleating, water flowing. And as we sit with these images, we realize that history is not only the story of great events, but also the story of mornings like this one. Mornings that stretched on quietly thousands of years ago until they faded into afternoons, and then into evenings, and then into nights. We will, of course, get to those later parts of the day in time, but for now, let us rest a moment here in the calm of a Babylonian morning. And so, the morning, with all its soft sounds and rising warmth, gently gives way to the middle hours of the day. The sun climbs higher, pressing down on the flat land of Mesopotamia. Shadows grow shorter, the air feels thicker, and the pace of life, though already slow, becomes slower still. Let us take our wandering path out of the city gates for a little while, into the countryside just beyond. Because most Babylonians were not kings or scribes or priests. Most were farmers, and to understand their day, we must watch them at work, or perhaps more accurately, at steady, patient labor that has no particular rush to it, the canals and the fields. The fields stretched outward in rectangles, each one carefully marked by low embankments of earth. Water flowed into them from canals, those long man-made veins cut into the plain, carrying the Euphrates into every corner of farmland. To maintain a canal was no small task. Imagine a group of men with shovels standing knee-deep in mud, clearing out silt that had built up after a flood. The mud, dark and sticky, clung to their legs, making every movement heavy. Reeds had to be cut back, stones pulled out, banks patched with clay. If one pauses here, one can think a very long time about the texture of Mesopotamian mud. It was thick enough to hold the imprint of a foot, but soft enough to squelch away again. A child playing near the canal might scoop up handfuls of it, shaping it into little lumps that hardened in the sun, only to crumble later. Mud, as ordinary as it is, was the very foundation of life here. Mud became bricks. Mud became pots. Mud carried water. Mud grew barley. One could almost say that Babylon was built on nothing more complicated than well-managed mud. The farmers worked with simple tools: wooden plows pulled by oxen, hoes, sickles made with flint or bronze blades. The wooden plow was not large. It scratched shallow furrows into the soil, but when pulled across the same field again and again, it prepared the ground for barley seeds. The sickle, with its curved edge, was perfect for cutting stalks, and many surviving sickle blades show the polish of long use. The rhythm of swinging a sickle, bending down, gathering stalks, and binding them with cord was the rhythm of harvest season. But even in midday, when seeds were sown or weeds pulled, the gestures were not so different: repetitive, simple, slow. Now, if you were to stand by a field at midday, you would see men in rough tunics, their backs darkened by the sun, their movements steady and unhurried. You might hear the splash of water as someone diverted a canal with a shovel, sending the flow into a dry patch of soil. You might hear the call of a boy chasing goats away from the tender shoots, waving his arms more out of habit than alarm. And above it all, you would hear silence, the deep, heavy silence of a hot day. A digression on shade. Shade was precious in Babylon. A single tree with its thin circle of coolness could become a gathering place. Farmers might sit beneath a palm, chewing dates and sipping water from a clay jar. The shade of a wall, too, was prized. Children would play in narrow alleys simply because the high mud-brick walls kept the worst of the sun away. Palm trees deserve a moment of their own. Tall, straight, with fronds that swayed in the faintest breeze, palms were useful from root to tip. Dates, of course, provided sweetness, chewy, rich, filling. But the fronds, when dried, were woven into mats and roofs. The trunk could be used as timber, though it was fibrous and not as strong as other wood. Imagine sitting under a palm, staring up at the patterned shadow of fronds flickering on the ground, and thinking about how many thousands of palms dotted the land, each one quietly offering shade and food. But let us wander back into the city now, because while the fields stretched endlessly, the city of Babylon had its own midday rhythm. The market, which we left earlier as stalls were being set up, was now busy, not bustling in the modern sense, no shouting, no rushing, but gently busy, like the steady flow of a river. People drifted in, bartering, weighing, and carrying goods. We can imagine a stall where a man sells onions. He arranges them in a pile, round and firm, their skins papery. He lifts one, turns it in his hand, sets it down again. Someone else brings him barley, weighed out on a balance scale with small stone weights. Each weight was carefully cut, and each one mattered. If a weight was too heavy or too light, it could cause arguments. But in most cases, people trusted the balance, because trade only works when trust outweighs suspicion. Nearby, another seller offers clay pots. The pots are rough, reddish-brown, still smelling faintly of the kiln. Some are large, meant for storing grain, while others are small, meant for oil or honey. The potter who made them would have spent hours at the wheel, his hands wet with clay, shaping the form, letting it dry, then firing it. If you pause to think, each pot has its own small history, from the gathering of clay to the shaping, drying, and baking. And all of those histories gather here in the market, where they wait to be bought and carried into kitchens.
And then there are the bakers, the smell of bread. Flat, round loaves baked against the hot walls of a clay oven drifts through the air. Bread was the staple of Babylon, and baking was constant. A baker pressed dough flat, slapped it against the inner wall of the oven, and let it cook in the rising heat. The loaves, once pulled out, were slightly charred at the edges, soft in the middle. They were eaten plain, or with onions, or dipped in oil. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the crackle of the fire, the soft thud of dough against clay, the faint murmur of voices bartering for bread, a pause for water. Now, midday in Babylon was hot, so hot that water was more than a necessity, it was a comfort. Water was carried in large clay jars, balanced on shoulders, poured into smaller cups. And because clay jars are porous, water stored in them slowly evaporated through the surface, cooling the contents inside. So a jar of water left in the shade was cooler than the air. That coolness, when sipped, was like a small gift. It is worth imagining how long it took to draw water, carry it, and pour it. A woman lowering a bucket into a well, the rope creaking, the bucket splashing, then the slow pull upward. Each trip took time, and each jar carried was heavy. And yet, this slow cycle of drawing and carrying and pouring was repeated endlessly, day after day, generation after generation. In its slowness, it became part of the rhythm of the city, like a heartbeat one hardly notices, a digression on animals. At midday, animals found their own places of rest. Goats clustered in shade, chewing steadily. Donkeys stood with drooping heads, flicking their tails at flies. Dogs, thin and restless, sniffed at scraps in the market, then flopped down in the dust. Cats, yes, there were cats, slipped along walls, watching for mice. Each animal had its role. Donkeys carried loads, goats gave milk, sheep gave wool, dogs guarded. Cats kept grain stores free of pests. None of this is especially exciting, and yet without animals, the quiet flow of Babylonian life would have faltered. And so, as you imagine the midday scene, remember the soft bleat of goats, the creak of donkeys' harnesses, the faint bark of a dog, the quiet of the early afternoon. As the sun reached its height, people slowed further. Work did not stop, but it stretched out lazily, like a long yawn. A farmer might rest against a wall, chewing dates slowly. A scribe, his eyes tired from pressing wedge marks into clay, might set his stylus aside for a few minutes. A woman grinding grain might pause to rub her hands, dusted with flour, and the city seemed to doze in its own way. Heat shimmered above the streets. The air grew still. Conversation softened. Even the market slowed, its busiest hour already past. If you, listening now, feel your own thoughts slow, that is only natural, for the early afternoon in Babylon was not meant for urgency. It was meant for persistence, for steady endurance, for the quiet acceptance that days pass not in bursts, but in slow, repeating cycles. And perhaps this is the heart of midday in Babylon, the recognition of cycles. The river flooded, and then it receded. Fields were planted, and then harvested. Bread was baked, and then eaten. Water was drawn and then spilled. Time itself was a circle, not a straight line. And the people of Babylon, living in their hot, dusty, fertile plain, moved along that circle, patiently. Even now, as we describe it, you might feel yourself circling back to the mud, back to the reed, back to the sound of grain grinding. These repetitions are not accidents, they are the fabric of life itself. And in their slow repetition, they invite the mind to drift, to soften,
to slip gently toward rest. And so the early afternoon continues, steady and quiet. Babylon breathes in the heat, exhales in the shade, and waits patiently for the evening hours to come. As the sun slides gently past its highest point, Babylon does not hurry. It does not suddenly change. It simply carries forward in the same steady rhythm that has guided so many afternoons before. The dust still clings to the sandals of passers-by. The river still moves, patient and brown. And within houses, courtyards, and markets, attention turns, slowly, naturally, to food. Because in Babylon, food was not just a necessity, it was a daily cycle, a repeated pattern of growing, grinding, baking, boiling, and eating. And in many ways, the city itself was built around this rhythm of nourishment. Barley, the foundation of the table. Barley was everywhere. If you were to look at the fields outside the city, you would see tall stalks of barley swaying in the breeze, their heads heavy with grain. If you were to step into a kitchen, you would find jars filled with barley, waiting to be ground or boiled. Barley bread, barley porridge, barley beer. This grain was the very foundation of Babylonian diet. Let us linger on barley for a while, because to rush past it would be to miss the very heart of daily sustenance. The grain itself was hardy, more tolerant of the hot, dry land than wheat. Its stalks grew quickly, and its yields were steady. A woman grinding barley at midday might spend hours with a simple handstone. Imagine the sound, scrape, 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 as the upper stone moved back and forth over the lower, crushing grain into flour. Each pass produced dust that clung to the air and to the skin. Hands grew tired, backs bent, and yet this work was done every day, without complaint, because without flour there could be no bread. The flour itself was not always fine. Sometimes it was coarse, with little husks mixed in. When baked into bread, these husks made the loaves dense, even gritty. Archaeologists have found that ancient teeth often wore down from years of chewing such bread, the grit grinding enamel away slowly. So when you imagine a Babylonian chewing a piece of bread, also imagine the faint crunch of husk and grit. Not unpleasant, but steady and very real. Bread, the ever-present loaf. Bread was not baked once and forgotten. It was baked daily, sometimes multiple times. The clay ovens, simple, round structures with an opening at the top, were heated with wood or reeds. A baker pressed flat rounds of dough against the hot inner wall, where they clung until the heat baked them through. Then, with careful fingers or a flat tool, the bread was pulled free, steaming, soft, and slightly blackened at the edges. Picture the scene: a courtyard with an oven glowing faintly red inside, smoke curling upward, a pile of reeds stacked nearby for fuel. Children sit close, waiting for the bread to cool just enough to tear into it. The smell is rich, earthy, warm, and faintly sweet. There were different kinds of bread: simple flatbread, thicker loaves, even breads flavored with onions, garlic, or dates. Some breads were baked plain, others sprinkled with sesame seeds. And because bread was eaten with nearly every meal, variety mattered, even in small ways. Bread, dipped in oil, eaten with onions, shared with friends. It was not a feast, but it was steady nourishment. Lentils and onions, humble companions. Alongside barley and bread came lentils, small, round, reddish, or brown. Lentils were boiled into stews that simmered slowly over fire. A pot of lentils, bubbling in the corner of a courtyard, filled the air with a simple, earthy aroma. Stew was flavored with onions, garlic, and herbs, sometimes with a little oil, sometimes with dried fish or goat meat, if available. Onions were as common then as they are now. Strong in flavor, they could be eaten raw with bread or cooked into stews. A Babylonian cutting onions for the pot might pause to wipe watering eyes, just as people do today. Some things in daily life have not changed at all. Lentils and onions might not sound exciting, but they were filling. reliable, and always present. One could almost measure the rhythm of Babylonian afternoons by the simmer of lentil stew, as steady and predictable as the movement of the sun.
Dates, sweetness in the shade. And then there were dates. The date palm, already mentioned for its shade, gave fruit that was both nourishing and sweet. Dates were eaten fresh, sticky and soft, or dried for storage. They could be pressed into cakes or used to sweeten beer. If you were to bite into a date in Babylon, the taste would be rich and syrupy, with a pit in the center that you would spit out or set aside. Hands grew sticky with the juice, and water was needed to wash them clean. But the sweetness was worth it, especially in a land where sugar did not exist. Sometimes dates were mashed into a paste and shaped into little cakes. These could be stored for later, easy to carry, easy to share. Imagine the traveler on the road reaching into his pouch for a date cake, chewing slowly as the sun beat down. That little sweetness would have been a comfort on long journeys. Beer, barley's liquid form. Now, we cannot speak of Babylonian food without speaking of beer. Beer, made from barley, was not quite like the beer we know today. It was thick, cloudy, sometimes flavored with dates. It was drunk through straws to filter out the bits of grain that floated in it. Beer was not only a drink for celebration, it was a daily staple. Men, women, and children drank it because it was safer than plain river water and provided calories as well as refreshment. Picture a clay jar of beer set in the shade with reed straws sticking out. A group of workers sitting in a circle take turns sipping. The taste is malty, slightly sour, filling. There were stronger beers, weaker beers, beers flavored with herbs. Some were for festivals, some for priests, some for ordinary people. But beer itself was never far away, always part of the afternoon meal, a tangent on weights and measures. And how did one buy bread, onions, or beer in the market? With silver, sometimes, or with barter. But most often, goods were weighed carefully. Stone weights, shaped like ducks or lions, sat beside the scales. Each weight was marked, sometimes with a symbol, sometimes with a number. Imagine the care with which a merchant adjusted the scale. A basket of barley on one side, a weight on the other. Slowly, slowly, the balance settles. If it tips too far, another handful of barley is added. If it tips the other way, a handful is removed. Such slow negotiations could take time, but in their slowness, they built trust. And without trust, markets could not function. The very idea of fairness, of honest weights, was so important that kings inscribed laws about it. But in the market itself, it was a matter of simple daily patience. Afternoon kitchens. Inside the houses of Babylon, the afternoon was often the time for preparing food. Courtyards filled with the smoke of small fires, pots bubbled, bread baked. Children carried water, fetched reeds, chased chickens. A kitchen was not a separate room as we imagine today. It was often a space in the open air with a clay oven, a few pots, and tools hung nearby. The smell of cooking was not confined to one place. It drifted into the streets, mingling with the dust and the heat. If you imagine walking down a narrow alley in Babylon at this hour, you would smell many different stews at once: lentils, onions, perhaps fish. You might smell bread or oil sizzling in a pan. And these scents, though ordinary, gave the city its own character, a tapestry of smells woven out of thousands of cooking fires. Rest and eating. When the food was ready, families gathered. They sat on mats, eating with their hands, dipping bread into bowls, sipping beer. Meals were shared slowly, without ceremony, because every day required them. Imagine a family, a father tearing bread in half, handing a piece to his son, a mother ladling stew into bowls, children dipping bread clumsily, spilling drops on the mat. The meal is quiet, but not silent. There is laughter, perhaps, or a few words about the field, the market, the goats. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just the slow passing of time, measured in bites and sips. And when the food was finished, bowls were rinsed, mats were shaken, and the family returned to the rhythm of the afternoon. A reflection on simplicity. The afternoon in Babylon was not marked by battles, proclamations, or grand events. It was marked by barley and bread, lentils and dates, onions and beer.
by grinding and baking, boiling and sipping, by the ordinary tasks that filled stomachs and sustained life. And perhaps that is why, as you listen now, you may feel your own breath soften, your own thoughts slow. For the story of Babylon's food is not a story of urgency. It is a story of repetition, of cycles, of nourishment given and taken day after day. And so the afternoon passes, in the kitchens, in the markets, in the fields, slowly, gently, without hurry, until the sun begins to dip again, and the thought of evening drifts into view.
The slow story of Babylonian buildings. As we move further along into the daily life of ancient Babylon, it may be worth pausing, as one often must, to think about the very buildings in which this life unfolded. After all, without buildings, people would have been outside all the time. And although the sun was warm and the breeze sometimes pleasant, one cannot spend every day under the open sky. And so the Babylonians, like so many others in Mesopotamia, made a habit of making walls, roofs, courtyards, doors, and of course, that most famous monument, the towering Ziggurat. Now, if one thinks of Babylon today, the imagination often runs directly to the great Ziggurat of Etemenanke, said to have inspired later tales of the Tower of Babel. But before we reach such lofty heights, let us go much more slowly, brick by brick, step by step, because, as you will soon see, nothing in Babylon was built quickly. The clay brick. The foundation of every Babylonian building was the clay brick. And to understand a Babylonian day, one must first understand the brick, because these small rectangles of baked or sun-dried earth were the very bones of the city. Clay was gathered from the banks of the Euphrates. This was not done in a hurry, and it was not done with great drama. Instead, workers patiently scooped out sticky mud, sometimes mixing in bits of straw or chaff to give the material strength. Imagine, if you will, the feeling of thick clay between your fingers, cool and heavy, leaving a residue that takes several rinses to wash away. The Babylonians knew this texture well. Once gathered, the clay was shaped into rectangular molds. These molds were simple wooden frames, and the workers would press the wet clay in, smooth the top with a flat board, and then carefully lift away the frame. The bricks would then be left out under the hot Mesopotamian sun to dry. This took days, sometimes longer, depending on the weather. One can imagine the rows of fresh bricks laid out like sleeping cattle in the field, each waiting for the sun to do its work. Some bricks, however, were not merely sun-dried, they were baked. This required kilns, large rounded ovens made of mud and brick themselves. The baking gave the bricks a reddish color, and more importantly, a hardness that resisted rain and time. But of course, baking bricks required fuel, and fuel in Mesopotamia was not as plentiful as one might like. Trees were not growing in abundance across the plains, and so fuel had to be carefully rationed. For this reason, most ordinary houses were built with sun-dried bricks, which lasted well enough for a time, though they had to be repaired often. Monumental structures like temples and ziggurats were given the stronger baked bricks, mortar and bitumen. Of course, a brick is nothing without something to hold it in place. For this, the Babylonians used mud mortar, which was essentially more of the same clay mixed into a paste. Occasionally, however, for important works, they used bitumen, a sticky black substance that oozed from the earth in certain places. If you have ever smelled tar on a hot summer road, you may already have some idea of what Babylonian bitumen smelled like. It was thick, heavy, and clung stubbornly to the hands. It sealed bricks against water, making it especially useful for canal walls and temple foundations. Now, let us imagine a small team of builders in Babylon sometime in the late morning. They have arrived at a construction site which is little more than a cleared rectangle of earth. Beside them are stacks of freshly dried bricks. The men line up the first course, then spread mud mortar, then another course, one brick at a time.
Each brick is lifted, carried, and placed with care. It is not fast work. A wall might rise only slowly over the course of days. And so, just as you listen now, feeling the minutes pass gently, so too did the Babylonian walls climb upward, not in leaps, but in slow, steady increments. The Ziggurat. And yet from these humble beginnings came the grandest of Mesopotamian buildings, the Ziggurat. Unlike a pyramid, which is smooth-sided, the Ziggurat rose in a series of terraces, each one smaller than the last, stacked like steps leading toward the heavens. The Ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanke, was said to have 7 levels, each one built of countless bricks. One can only imagine how many hours, how many hands, and how many thousands of bricks were needed for such a task. A curious fact is that ziggurats were not hollow. They were solid, filled with earth and rubble inside, and faced with brick outside. This meant that much of the material was not even visible, hidden forever under the structure, yet still carried and placed with labor. It is a thought both humbling and a little drowsy to imagine workers toiling over bricks that no one would ever see. At the top of the ziggurat was a small temple, sometimes painted in bright colors, where the gods were thought to descend. Whether or not the gods indeed made their way down those baked steps of clay is a matter for belief. What we know is that priests ascended the many stairs, perhaps daily, perhaps more often, carrying offerings, lighting fires, and tending to their sacred duties. Doors and gates. Of course, not every building was as grand as the ziggurat. Many were simple homes, small and square, with a central courtyard open to the sky. These houses too had doors and sometimes wooden frames. Wood, as mentioned before, was scarce, so it was prized. A wooden door was not something one discarded lightly. Hinges were often made of bronze when available, though simple pivot stones also served. And then there were the great gates of the city, like the famous Ishtar Gate, glazed bricks of brilliant blue, adorned with lions and dragons, greeted visitors with a sight both impressive and a little overwhelming. The glaze was created by firing minerals into the bricks, a process requiring both knowledge and patience. To walk through such a gate was not a quick matter. It was a slow passage, perhaps by design, reminding all who entered that they were stepping into something greater than themselves. Roads and pavements. As we think of buildings, we should not forget the roads that connected them. Many streets in Babylon were not paved, but some, especially near the center, were lined with baked brick. These bricks, like those of the walls, had to be carefully placed, each one pressed into the earth, aligned and leveled. Over time, the bricks wore down under the feet of countless passers-by and under the wheels of carts. One can imagine the faint grooves left behind, the soft marks of centuries of traffic. A pause. As you listen to these details, the clay mixed, the bricks dried, the walls lifted, you may feel your own mind beginning to build a kind of drowsy structure. Each detail is like a brick, placed one upon another, slow and steady, until the whole begins to rise. Perhaps you feel the weight of your eyelids, much like the weight of the sun upon the drying bricks. This is natural. Babylon itself was a city built on patience, and so too your thoughts may drift slowly, patiently toward rest. And so, as the sun climbs higher in our imagined Babylonian day, the buildings stand firm, their walls reflecting the light, their doors creaking gently, their ziggurats casting long, square shadows, and the city breathes on, brick by brick, wall by wall, a place both solid and eternal, yet also fragile in the endless march of time. Temples, priests, and the endless details of ritual. As our day in Babylon stretches further, and as the sun begins to rise toward its highest point, we should probably wander in our minds away from the houses and roads and into the most sacred part of the city, its temples. Babylon was not merely a place of trade and farming, not merely a collection of bricks and streets, but also, above all, a city of gods. Every corner of life, from bread baked in the morning to the opening of the city gates, was touched by the unseen presence of divine powers, the temples. The Babylonians built many temples. These were not small shrines tucked in corners, but large, impressive complexes, often attached to or near ziggurats. Each temple was devoted to a specific god or goddess. The great temple of Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, was called the Esagila, which meant the house of the raised head. One imagines this name was chosen carefully, for a raised head implies dignity, grandeur, and perhaps a certain kind of pride. Inside these temples, there were chambers, courtyards, and storage rooms. The floors might be swept clean, sometimes sprinkled with water to settle the dust. Walls might be decorated, though one should not imagine them as richly painted as later cathedrals. Instead, the atmosphere was solemn, orderly, and quiet. In the very center of each temple, there would be a cult statue, not large in every case, but of great importance. To the Babylonians, these statues were not simply representations of gods, they were treated as the very embodiment of the gods themselves, priests and their duties. Now, who tended to these temples? The priests. And here we must slow down considerably, because the priests of Babylon had a great many responsibilities, and they carried them out with a calm, methodical pace that we too should imitate as we consider them. The priests were divided into ranks. Some were high priests, some lower assistants, some were musicians, and some were mere attendants. Each had a role, and each role was part of the greater machine of temple ritual. Morning would often begin with offerings. Bread, beer, sometimes meat, sometimes fruit, were placed before the statue of the god. One may ask, did the god eat these offerings? Not in the way a person would. The Babylonians believed that the god consumed the essence of the food, leaving the physical remains to be eaten later by the priests themselves, and so nothing was wasted. Incense was also burned. The smoke rose slowly, filling the air with a sweet, heavy scent. Imagine, if you will, standing in a cool, shadowed hall, the walls of mud brick, the floors swept, and the air thick with fragrant smoke curling upward. It was not dramatic, not noisy. It was quiet, repetitive, and steady. Rituals and repetition. The rituals themselves were not quick ceremonies. They involved chants, prayers, and the careful washing of statues. A god statue might be bathed, anointed with oil, dressed in fine garments, and given ornaments of gold or lapis lazuli. Each step was done with slow precision. If you are beginning to feel as though time itself is lengthening, you are not alone. This was the experience of Babylonian religion too. Consider the festival of the New Year, called the Akitu. This was one of the most important celebrations in Babylon. It lasted for days, with processions, sacrifices, and the recitation of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story. Imagine priests chanting long verses, word after word, line after line, for hours on end. A listener might well have found their eyelids heavy, not because the words lacked meaning, but because the rhythm was slow and steady, a kind of sacred lullaby.
The scribes and their styluses. But the temples were not only places of ritual, they were also centers of record-keeping. And this brings us to the scribes. If there is a quieter, more patient profession in Babylon, one would be hard-pressed to find it. The scribes sat with clay tablets before them, inscribing with reed styluses the cuneiform signs that recorded offerings, temple inventories, hymns, and contracts. The stylus itself deserves a pause. It was usually a sharpened reed cut carefully to create a triangular tip. This tip, pressed into the soft clay, left the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform writing. Now, one might think sharpening a reed would be a quick task, but it was not. It required attention. The reed had to be cut at the right angle, smoothed to the right shape, hardened sometimes in fire, and kept in good condition. A dull stylus made ugly marks. A sharp one, however, made clean impressions. And so we may picture a scribe pausing in his work, examining the end of his stylus. Perhaps he takes out a small knife, trims the edge carefully, tests it on a piece of scrap clay, then returns to his tablet.
This process, repeated dozens of times, was as much a part of temple life as incense or chanting. The tablets themselves, once written, the clay tablets might be left to dry in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanence. Thousands upon thousands of such tablets have been found, many in the ruins of Babylon and other Mesopotamian cities. Some record the smallest of details, lists of sheep, measures of barley, rations of beer for workers. These are not dramatic records, but they are steady, reliable, and numerous. It is worth imagining, just for a moment, the shelves of a temple archive, lined with clay tablets, each one cooled to the touch, each one marked with careful wedges. To walk along such shelves would have been like walking through the mind of the city itself. Every detail of life was pressed into clay, preserved for centuries, even millennia. A gentle reflection. As you think about these temples, priests, rituals, and scribes, you may feel the pace of your own thoughts slowing. The incense smoke curls lazily in the air. The chants echo, not urgently, but softly. The scribe scratches his reed across clay, not hurriedly, but methodically. Time stretches. The city breathes quietly, and you too may find your own breath falling into that rhythm, slow, steady, restful. And so, as our day in Babylon passes noon and begins to move toward afternoon, the temples stand firm. The priests continue their endless duties, and the scribes record one more careful line upon a tablet. The gods, one assumes, were satisfied, and the city carried on.
Government, administration, and the patient world of seals. When one imagines Babylon, one often thinks of temples and ziggurats, or perhaps of markets and canals. But behind all of this was an invisible system, a slow-moving but steady web of officials, scribes, tax collectors, and administrators who ensured that the city and its countryside continued to function. It is not the most thrilling part of history, but it is perhaps the most enduring. And so, if you find your mind growing heavy as we wander through Babylon's paperwork, you are in good company. The kings and their authority. At the very top of Babylonian government stood the king. Kings were not just rulers, they were seen as chosen by the gods. Hammurabi, for example, famously received his law code from Shamash, the sun god of justice, at least according to the stone inscriptions. Whether or not the gods personally handed him a stylus, the people accepted this idea, and so his authority was not only political, but divine. But kings could not manage everything. They delegated tasks down through layers of officials. These officials, in turn, relied on scribes and assistants. And so, much like the many bricks in a Babylonian wall, the government was made up of countless small rolls, each one stacked upon another. Taxes and rations. One of the primary duties of Babylonian administration was the collection of taxes. These taxes were not usually paid in coins, since coinage was not yet in common use, but in goods. Farmers might deliver barley, shepherds might deliver sheep or wool, fishermen might bring baskets of fish. All of these goods had to be counted, measured, recorded, and stored. To ensure fairness, standardized weights and measures were used. These were not modern digital scales, of course, but carefully carved stones, each one representing a set amount. A heavy stone might be placed on one side of a balance and grain on the other until equilibrium was reached. The process was not quick. Each basket of barley was poured, measured, adjusted, and measured again. Once collected, these goods were redistributed. Workers building canals might receive daily rations of barley or beer. Soldiers on campaign might be issued wool for clothing. Priests, as we saw before, received food from temple offerings. And all of this, every sheep, every sack, every drop of oil, was written down. Clay tablets as paperwork. Here again, the clay tablet comes into play. If you imagine your own desk piled with papers, you may get a faint picture of the Babylonian office. But instead of thin sheets of paper, imagine heavy clay tablets stacked on shelves, each one carefully marked in cuneiform script.
A single receipt might record that a man named Bel-Iddin delivered 5 sheep to the temple on a certain day. Another tablet might record that 2 jars of oil were issued to workers repairing a city gate. Multiply this by thousands, and you begin to see the endless rhythm of administration. The seals. But how did one verify that a tablet was genuine? For this, the Babylonians used seals. A seal was often a small cylinder of stone, carved with intricate designs. When rolled across the surface of wet clay, the seal left behind an impression, a tiny image, like a stamp. Each official had their own seal, unique to them, much as a signature is unique today. The designs were elaborate. Some showed scenes of gods standing on mountains. Others depicted animals or men in prayer. To make a seal required skill. Stone had to be carved with delicate tools, each line precise, so that when pressed into clay, the picture appeared clearly. One can imagine an official pausing at his desk, carefully rolling his cylinder across the surface of a tablet, the image unfurling like a miniature painting. The seals were not only functional, they were also personal. To lose one's seal would have been as troublesome as losing one's identity card or digital password today. It meant someone else could impersonate you in the clay record, a serious concern in a society where so much depended on written contracts. Storage jars and granaries. Of course, the collected goods themselves had to be stored. This brings us to jars, granaries, and storehouses. Large clay jars, some almost as tall as a person, were used to hold oil, beer, or grain. The jars were sealed at the top with clay stoppers, sometimes marked with the seal of an official to ensure they were not tampered with. Granaries were simple mud brick structures, but their importance was immense. A city depended on its stored food, especially in times of poor harvest or conflict. To step inside a granary would have been to step into a cool, dim space filled with the scent of grain, the air thick with dust, and the quiet rustle of mice that no doubt tried their luck at nibbling, a bureaucracy without end. And so, as the afternoon passes in our imagined day, the city hums with the low, steady rhythm of bureaucracy. Officials check lists, scribes scratch tablets, seals roll across clay, jars are filled, stacked, and sealed. Sheep bleat as they are pounted. The government of Babylon was not fast, but it was thorough, and it kept the city running. A gentle reminder. As you listen, you may find that the details of taxation and storage have a way of softening the mind. One sheep delivered, one jar sealed, one tablet stacked on a shelf. The repetition is almost hypnotic, like the steady turning of a potter's wheel. It goes on and on, without hurry, without pause. If you are feeling your own thoughts growing heavy as we wander through Babylon's paperwork, you are in good company. And so, as our day moves further into the quiet hours of afternoon, the government of Babylon continues its endless patient work. Each seal pressed into clay, each jar filled, each tablet inscribed. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just the slow, steady heartbeat of administration.
Trade, boats, donkeys, and the long, twisting story of rope. By the time afternoon settles over Babylon, the sun leaning westward, but still warm, the city is far from asleep. In fact, this is when trade often reached its most visible rhythm. Goods were arriving and departing, carried by animals, carts, or boats, and the marketplace hummed with a steady murmur. Not a frantic noise, but a low, even tone, the sound of bargaining, measuring, and exchanging. The marketplaces of Babylon. Imagine, if you will, walking slowly through one of Babylon's markets. The ground beneath you is packed earth, with occasional patches of brick paving near the stalls of the more prosperous merchants. On either side are rows of sellers, some seated behind woven mats spread with goods, others operating from wooden stalls with awnings of cloth. Here, a man offers barley, measured carefully by volume in a clay scoop. There, a woman has baskets of onions, leeks, and perhaps a few dates. A potter sets out his vessels, each one slightly different, though they blur together after a while,
much as rows of clay bricks do when left drying in the sun. And always there are scribes, for many trades required written contracts. If you were buying a large amount of grain, or hiring a worker, or leasing a donkey, you would likely stop by a scribe seated with his tablet. He would press the details into clay, names, quantities, witnesses, seals. Every exchange left a mark, not only in memory, but in cuneiform, boats on the Euphrates. But of course, much of Babylon's trade was not confined to the city's walls. The Euphrates itself was a slow brown ribbon of commerce. Boats of reed and wood floated downstream, loaded with cargo. Some were small rafts, built from bundled reeds coated with bitumen to keep the water out. Others were larger wooden vessels, broad and flat, meant to carry heavy loads. They were not fast. No boat on the Euphrates ever raced against the current. Instead, they drifted gently, sometimes with a pole to guide them, sometimes pulled by ropes from the shore. If you imagine standing on the riverbank, you might see a boat gliding by, piled high with jars of oil, baskets of grain, or bundles of reeds. The men aboard lean lazily on their poles, letting the current do most of the work. The water laps softly, gulls wheel overhead, and everything seems to move at half the speed of time itself. And then, when the boats reached their destination, the cargo would be unloaded, jar after jar, basket after basket, lifted slowly, carried carefully, placed one upon another in neat rows. Trade by river was not exciting. It was steady, repetitive, and dependable. Donkeys on the road. On land, the donkey was the backbone of transportation. Small, sturdy, patient, the donkey could carry heavy loads or pull carts. To picture a Babylonian street without donkeys would be like picturing a modern city without trucks. The donkey's pace was never hurried. They plodded along, ears flicking at flies, hooves clopping steadily on packed earth. A merchant might lead 2 or 3 donkeys in a line, each loaded with sacks of barley or jars of oil. The animals did not complain loudly, though they might bray now and then, a sound both plaintive and oddly soothing in its monotony. Carts, too, were pulled by donkeys. Wooden wheels, not perfectly round but serviceable, creaked as they turned. The axle groaned, the cart bumped, and yet the donkey kept moving, step by patient step, until the journey was complete. Rope and its many twists. Now, all of this trade, boats tied to docks, donkeys loaded with sacks, carts lashed with jars, depended on one humble but indispensable item, rope. And rope, though simple, deserves our attention. Rope was usually made from twisted plant fibers, often palm or reed. The fibers were gathered, dried, and then spun together. 2 strands twisted one way, another strand twisted opposite, until the tension held. The process was slow, and one imagines rope makers sitting for hours, their hands busy while their thoughts drifted. The rope had to be strong. Too weak, and it snapped under the weight of a jar. Too stiff, and it could not be tied. So there was a balance, achieved only through steady, practiced work. Some ropes were thin, meant for tying small bundles. Others were thick, strong enough to tether a boat or lash down cargo. Rope wore out, of course. It frayed, unraveled, and weakened. And so ropes were constantly being replaced, spliced, or mended. A careful eye was needed, for a single broken rope could send a jar crashing to the ground, or a boat drifting loose into the river. The endless exchanges. And so, as the afternoon continues, trade goes on. Goods move from hand to hand, from boat to shore, from donkey to stall. Nothing is rushed. Each step is measured, each transaction noted. The city thrives not in bursts of speed, but in long, steady flows, like the Euphrates itself. A drowsy thought. As you imagine the markets, the boats, the donkeys, and the ropes, you may feel your own thoughts tying themselves into gentle knots. One loop of detail leads to another, then another, until the whole becomes a long, twisting cord of history. Much like Babylon's rope makers, we spin fibers of information together, strand by strand,
until the result is strong, steady, and perhaps a little hypnotic. If your eyes feel heavy, think of the slow river, the patient donkey, the turning wheel, the twisting rope. All move at their own pace, unhurried, unchanging, and so too can you. And so the trade of Babylon carries on into the late afternoon, never dramatic, never still, always moving, always repeating. A city bound together by bricks and ropes, by donkeys and boats, by merchants and scribes, and the day drifts gently forward.
Craftsmen, potters, weavers, and the gentle rhythm of labor. As afternoon turns toward early evening in Babylon, the markets quiet slightly. The boats on the Euphrates glide more lazily, and the long shadows of buildings stretch across the city streets. But the work of the city does not end. If anything, this is the time when the craftsmen, those patient and steady workers, take center stage. Their work is precise, repetitive, and endlessly detailed. And it is here, perhaps, that one begins to truly appreciate the quiet rhythm of Babylonian life. Potters at the wheel. Consider the potters first. Pottery was not merely functional, it was essential. Every home, temple, and market relied on jars, bowls, cups, and storage vessels. And to make these, clay had to be carefully prepared. The potter began by kneading the clay, removing stones and lumps. Then, sitting before a slow-turning wheel, the clay was placed at its center. With careful, wet fingers, the potter coaxed the clay upward, shaping it gradually. The walls of the pot thinned slowly, almost imperceptibly as the wheel turned. The shaping of a pot could take hours, each motion repeated hundreds of times. Fingers pressed lightly, then more firmly, the clay rising into a bowl, a jar, or a cup. After shaping, the piece was left to dry, often in the sun, for days. Once dried, it might be fired in a kiln, where heat transformed the soft clay into a hard, lasting vessel. It is worth pausing, even here, to notice the smells. Drying clay has a particular scent, earthy and faintly sweet. Fired clay has a slightly smokier aroma, as though it remembers the fire it endured. A potter's courtyard would be filled with these scents, and if you were there, you might feel the slow passage of time as each vessel gradually took shape. Weavers at the loom. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the weavers were at work. Babylonian textiles were made from wool or flax, and sometimes dyed with natural colors. The weaver sat before a vertical or horizontal loom, carefully threading each string of the warp, counting each pass, pulling each thread through with methodical attention. A simple cloth might take days to produce. Patterns were sometimes added, simple geometric shapes or stripes, but even plain weaving required constant focus. The rhythmic movement of shuttle and thread, over and under, created not only fabric, but a quiet, almost meditative sound. Soft clacks, gentle swishes, a sound that might lull both the weaver and anyone nearby into a calm, reflective state. Metalworkers and jewelers. Some craftsmen worked with metal, though less commonly than clay or textiles. Bronze and copper were melted and poured into molds, hammered into shape, or engraved with small designs. Small tools, jewelry, pins, and ornaments were all painstakingly formed. Even the process of heating metal was slow. Fires had to be kept at a steady temperature. Metal was added gradually. Too hot, and it could be ruined. Too cold, and it would not flow. The metal worker's attention was constant, the pace deliberate, the rewards modest but lasting. Daily tools and minor details. Every craft depended on small, often overlooked tools: clay knives, shaping sticks, water bowls, polishing stones, weaving shuttles, spindles or bobbins, hammers, anvils, and molds for metal. The repetition of their use day after day was not exciting, but it was essential. Even the drying of materials, whether clay pots or woven textiles, required attention. Sun, wind, and humidity were watched closely. Too much sun and cloth could fade or warp. Too little and clay would crack before firing. Craftsmen observed these details with quiet patience, their eyes scanning the materials, their hands adjusting, reshaping, pressing, and smoothing. Children and apprentices. Often children or apprentices were present, learning slowly, repeating the motions of their elders. An apprentice might carry water to wet the clay, thread the loom, or grind pigments for dyes. Their work was slow, sometimes awkward, but essential to learning.
Over years, these repetitive actions built skill, and eventually the apprentice became the master, continuing the slow, patient traditions of Babylon, the rhythm of craft. As the afternoon drifts into evening, the workshops continue. Clay spins, threads pass over and under, metal glows faintly in a kiln or furnace. There is no hurry. There is no drama. There is only the slow, steady rhythm of hands, time, and materials working together. It is in this slow repetition that Babylon lived. The city's life was measured not by great events, but by countless small, patient actions, the shaping of a pot, the threading of a loom, the careful twisting of a rope, the stacking of bricks, the pressing of seals. And as you listen, you may find your own thoughts echoing this rhythm, your mind turning slowly over the details, your body settling comfortably, gently into rest, a gentle pause. If you imagine yourself walking past the workshops, the scent of clay and wool in the air, the soft sound of threads moving over warp threads, the occasional clink of a metal tool, you may notice your breath slowing. The day continues, unhurried, steady, calm, and all of Babylon seems to move at this same unremarkable pace. Evening is approaching, but the work does not halt entirely. Some tasks continue until twilight, especially those that cannot be interrupted. A kiln firing, a piece of pottery left to dry, a warp thread needing one final pass. And yet, even in this continuation, there is a softness, a quiet rhythm, a patient repetition that soothes as it persists.
Evening life, music, storytelling, and the gentle calm of night. As the sun begins to sink toward the western horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the streets and courtyards of Babylon, the day gradually shifts. The bright, dusty bustle of the markets softens. Boats on the Euphrates glide with less urgency, their cargoes already delivered. Donkeys plod more slowly along the packed roads, and within the city, evening routines take over, quieting the rhythm of work and trade and allowing a gentler, more personal pace to take hold. Returning home, families return to their homes. The streets, once filled with the shuffling of sandals and the murmurs of merchants, become quieter. The clay walls of the houses, warmed by the afternoon sun, begin to cool. In courtyards, the smell of late cooking, perhaps a final stew or some roasted dates, fills the air, mingling with the earthy scent of dust settling from the streets. Within homes, small children might still be playing with simple toys, miniature clay animals, small woven dolls, sticks and stones. The younger ones, having spent the day helping or watching, are now calmer, more subdued, tired from activity. The older children may assist with tidying the courtyard, moving mats or carrying water, their movements steady and unhurried. Music in the evening. Evening was also a time for music. Simple instruments, harps, lyres, flutes, and small percussion filled the air with gentle sound. The lyre, with its wooden frame and stretched gut strings, produced a soft, resonant tone. A musician plucked each string slowly, deliberately, listening to the vibration, adjusting finger positions, allowing each note to settle before moving to the next. The music was not loud or energetic. It was calm, soothing, and often repetitive, built on slow progressions that mirrored the rhythm of daily life. A flute might play a single melodic line, repeated softly, while the harp provided a gentle backdrop. The combined effect was like the lapping of water against a riverbank, continuous, gentle, hypnotic. Storytelling and oral tradition. Stories were told in the evenings as well. Fathers, mothers, or professional storytellers would recount tales of gods, kings, heroes, and sometimes mundane, yet comforting anecdotes about the city itself. The tales were long, filled with digressions, descriptions of minor events, and details of places, objects, or customs. A storyteller might pause to describe a temple's courtyard, the exact pattern of bricks, the color of a priest's robe, the length of a canal, or even the precise method by which grain was measured. These tangents,
though seemingly trivial, were part of the charm and rhythm of storytelling. Listeners, absorbed by the gentle repetition and rich detail, often found their thoughts slowing, their minds wandering calmly through the city and its daily life, meals and evening routines. Dinner in Babylon was typically lighter than midday meals, but still steady and nourishing. Bread, sometimes dipped in oil or honey, lentil stew, dates, and water or beer composed the standard fare. The food was eaten slowly, without rush, often with conversation that drifted in minor tangents, remarks about a neighbor's donkey, observations of the river, or reflections on a recent visit to the temple. Families washed up carefully afterwards. Water was carried in small jars from wells or cisterns, used to rinse hands and faces. Mats were spread neatly in courtyards or rooms for seating, and items were put away, ready for the next day. These simple, repeated actions, unchanging yet essential, created a steady rhythm, a predictable end to the work and activity of the day. The slow closing of the day. As twilight deepened, the city grew quieter. Some homes lit small oil lamps, their soft flickering light casting shadows across walls and floors. The lamps, filled with oil and equipped with wicks, burned slowly, a constant, gentle presence. Outside, the faint sounds of the river continued. Occasionally, a donkey brayed somewhere distant, or a boat creaked as it settled for the night. But these were soft, unobtrusive noises, blending into the calm of early evening. In the temples, fires might still burn, tending to sacred duties, but the bulk of daily activity had concluded. Craftsmen rested, markets were empty, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of life shifted toward reflection, relaxation, and quiet. A gentle reflection. As you imagine this, you may feel your own mind drifting. Picture the courtyard, soft shadows, the warm glow of lamps, faint music, distant river sounds, the smell of cooked grains and clay dust. Children are dozing, elders are seated calmly, stories are winding to a close. Even the city's walls, long and sun-warmed, seem to exhale gently with the cooling air. Time feels slow in Babylon, and perhaps your own perception of time slows as well. One detail leads to another. The flicker of a lamp, the pluck of a lyre string, the measured movements of a scribe closing his tablet. Each motion is deliberate, steady, almost hypnotic. The day, long and filled with repetition and rhythm, now fades gently. There is no urgency, no rush to finish. Everything unfolds slowly, predictably, and with a comforting regularity. And as you continue to imagine this, you may feel your eyelids becoming heavier, your breathing softer, your mind gradually easing toward rest.
Nightfall, the river, and the gentle fade of Babylon. As night falls over Babylon, the city undergoes a quiet transformation. The heat of the day has softened. The streets are cooler under the pale glow of the moon, and the city breathes more slowly. Evening music fades, stories conclude, and the last of the market stalls are closed. Lamps burn softly in homes, casting warm, flickering light across courtyards and walls. And the Euphrates reflects the stars like a long, quiet ribbon of silver. The river at night, the Euphrates itself, continues its slow, unhurried flow. Boats that drifted lazily in the afternoon are now tied securely to the riverbank. The water laps gently against hulls and reeds, a soft, repetitive sound that carries lightly through the air. One can imagine a fisherman pausing at the edge of the river, watching the faint ripples, listening to the murmur of water, and feeling the calm descend over the city. Occasionally, a small animal moves through the reeds, rustling softly. Night birds may call from distant trees. These sounds, though minor, form a quiet symphony of the natural world, interwoven with the city's subtle rhythms. Even in the heart of Babylon, the pulse of nature remains present, softening the edges of human activity and lulling the city into repose. Nighttime in the city. Inside homes, families settle in. Mats and bedding are spread, small children are tucked under covers, and the faint glow of oil lamps flickers in quiet rooms. Adults may reflect on the day, the movement of goods, the placement of bricks, the progress of crafts, the simple pleasures of music or conversation. Thoughts drift gently, like the slow turning of the river over minor details, little victories, and repeated tasks. Some courtyards are empty, their shadows stretching across sun-warmed walls. Others are softly lit, the sound of a distant harp string, a whisper of conversation, the quiet tap of a stylus against clay. Everything is slower now. Even the donkeys, long rested, are still in their pens, chewing softly, their hooves producing faint, rhythmic sounds, reflections on the day. As you listen, it may help to consider the entirety of the day, slowly moving through memory, as if walking through the streets of Babylon. The early morning clay bricks, drying in the sun, the ziggurat rising, brick by patient brick, the temple rituals, incense curling upward, priests moving deliberately, scribes pressing styluses into clay, officials tallying taxes, trade continuing along roads and rivers, craftsmen shaping pots, weaving cloth, hammering metal, children learning patiently, evening music drifting through quiet courtyards. Everything repeats, everything continues. There is a rhythm, steady and calm, a city functioning in gentle, predictable patterns, offering a quiet reminder that life, while full of work and detail, also carries the possibility of rest, reflection, and continuity. The comfort of small details. One may notice as the city slows, the comfort found in small, repetitive tasks, the twisting of rope, the stacking of jars, the soft pluck of a lyre string, the slow drying of clay. These minor, unremarkable actions, when observed patiently, become soothing. They offer a steady pulse, much like the slow, constant current of the Euphrates. They remind us that life does not always need drama or excitement to be meaningful. It thrives in rhythm, in careful attention, in repetition, in enduring patterns that carry the city and its people through time. A gentle fade. As night deepens, the city seems to exhale. Lamps flicker once more before the wicks burn low. The river continues its gentle murmur. The wind shifts slightly, stirring leaves in quiet courtyards. And in homes across Babylon, families sleep, children dreaming, adults resting, all carried gently by the calm, steady pulse of their surroundings. And you, having traveled with the city through a full day, may notice your own breath slowing, your mind softening, thoughts unwinding one by one. You have moved through streets, workshops, temples, markets, and riverbanks. You have listened to the small, patient rhythms of life as it was lived long ago. Now, as the city sleeps, so too may your mind drift. Each detail,
Each image, each tiny motion of Babylon fades gently into memory, leaving only a sense of calm, steady continuity. And if you close your eyes, you may carry this rhythm with you, allowing it to settle into a quiet, restful space, guiding you slowly into your own night of sleep.